All right, hey everyone, and welcome to a little video called Trail Talk. What we're doing with this series is we're diving into some of the topics that give a little more detail about the world of the men involved on the Overmountain Victory Trail. The Overmountain settlements, the Piedmont of the Carolinas, all different aspects of it to better understand who these people were, the men, the boys, the women involved, and better understand their story. Now, one thing that you'll find is you study the story of the Overmountain Victory Trail and the Battle of Kings Mountain. People want to know about the aftermath. They want to know about the prisoners that were captured by the Patriots. And if you read some journals and accounts, they talk about going to Bethabara, going to the Moravian towns. So we have with us today Samantha Smith. She is the current Director of Community Engagement and Digital Learning at Old Salem Museums and Gardens, but also the former director of 3 years at historic Bethabara Park. So she is heavily involved with those towns up there. And she's also a former veteran of the Green and Gray, a former park seasonal at Guilford Courthouse National Military Park over at GUCO. But prior to these positions, Sam also has an undergrad in history and anthropology from NC State. She has a master's in public history and cultural resource management, and also a certification in historic preservation from UNC Greensboro. So Sam, thanks for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation.
Great. Now, to kind of just start out, when we're talking about these towns and Bethabara, we have the historic sites, but the historic Bethabara and Old Salem. But for those who aren't familiar, where are these places in current North Carolina?
Sure. So when the Moravians came to North Carolina, there were several towns that they settled. The very first one was Bethabara. And like you said, it is now a historic site, historic Bethabara Park. That's located in what is now northwest Winston-Salem. They also established Bethania, which is also kind of northwest, a little more north, Winston-Salem, Hope, Friedland, Friedberg, and Salem. Salem is the more central town, and you can visit today. It's kind of the county, not county seat. I guess the city center is really close to where Salem is located, the historic site and town. Okay,
so nice little day trip, head up there. Are they all kind of fairly near one another, or are they kind of scattered?
Absolutely. Yeah, they're really close. I'd say within like a 10-15 minute drive. So if you are planning on coming to visit the Moravian towns, as you all call them, which I love, you can. They're all within driving distance. Bethania does have a visitor center as well. I think right now it's closed because of COVID, but Michelle Williams, who works there, is fantastic, and she gives guided trail walks. So that's also a really fun trip.
Well, there you go. Get some history, go into Winston, get some grub, call it a day.
Absolutely.
So like you just mentioned, though, how we call them the Moravian towns, because that's how they're referred to in these journals and letters.
Yes.
Why are they called Moravians? Where does that name come from, for those who aren't familiar with it?
Sure. So the Moravian faith is actually the oldest Protestant denomination in the world, or at least one of the oldest. They trace their origin to the 15th century with religious reformer Jan Hus, who was actually martyred in 1415 by the Holy Roman Church. He was burned at the stake for heresy. And 50 years later, after Huss's death, this new sort of Protestant group formed that was called the Unitas Fratrum in Latin, or what we call the United Brethren. And that group grew to over 200,000 followers by the early 1500s. And the Unitas Fratrum, or United Brethren, became Moravian because between 1500 and 1700, a lot of the congregants were facing a lot of turmoil due to the Counter-Reformation, especially, which happened in the 1620s. So many of these followers were forced to practice their faith in secret. So a lot of these followers went underground, and it was known as the hidden seed. So by 1722, some of these exiled brethren who were from Moravia fled to this guy named Count Zinzendorf's home, and Count Zinzendorf becomes the patron of the Moravians. And these exiles from Moravia were referred to as Moravians. So that's become the more modern or informal name for the followers of the faith.
So it's kind of like also with another ethnic group we have with our story and our history of the Scot-Irish. Well, are they Irish, Scots, Ulster Scots, you know? So it's more of where they're from, or where a lot of them are from, more than any other kind of identifying feature. Would they have called themselves the Brethren then?
They do, yeah. If you read the primary sources, they'll say brother, last name, sister, last name. They are known as the Brethren. So when we're talking about them, we try to use Brethren sometimes, but for the most part, we use Moravian. It's kind of the informal expression.
Formal and casual.
Yes.
Two
That's a good way to think
of history. I got you.
Right.
Cool. And then just another great way to see how these little rabbit trails from one story can go into this massive other research and going into counter reformations and all kinds of deep stories there. That's kind of deep stories there.
I think I went out for a second. Am I back?
Yep, I got you. Okay. All right. So moving on with our questions. We talked a little bit about how you said that they were the oldest Protestant denomination, or one of them. The next question I kind of had was, how are they different? How is their culture different from what they're finding here in Piedmont, North Carolina? Because we have a lot of immigration happening from the north, Virginia, Pennsylvania, the Scot-Irish that I mentioned. Are there any kind of major differences, obvious differences between the Brethren and their neighbors?
Absolutely, yes. The Moravians were very different from other settlers in the region. They were even different from other German neighbors that they had, because the Moravians, they were separatists, and they relied on a totally outside sort of theocracy. Even their economy, it was called the O economy. They were almost what you would call, I mean, they're a closed society, and you can almost call them a utopian society. And they were extremely religious. They held multiple church services daily, and their faith was a huge part of their lives. It was just embedded in the town. And there were certain physical ways that you could tell that the Moravians were different. And the main way is their clothing, the way that they dressed. The Moravians wore kind of bizarre for the time clothing that was German peasant clothing. And they wore an identifying hat called a haube. That's Haube, haube. And if you go on Bethabra's Facebook page, actually, we have a virtual field trip that our volunteer Jacob Cruz did for us about Moravian fashion. And it's really interesting. It'll kind of give you some insight on how clothing can represent the Moravians' sort of separatist beliefs, and also their belief that everyone is equal. Because we call this clothing the Moravian uniform, and it was used as an equalizer to not have anybody show off any wealth with fancy fabrics or brand new styles. It was supposed to represent that everyone who was Moravian was equal under the eyes of God.
Okay, wow. So yeah, very, very different from your kind of consumer culture that you'd have up and coming middle class in the North Carolina Piedmont.
Very different.
Now, so they're so different. Why are they in North Carolina? Like, is there a story? Is there a reason that they're in Piedmont, North Carolina, way out in the middle of these other little settlements?
Yeah, absolutely. So originally, when the Moravians decided to come over to the New World, they started in Georgia, and Georgia didn't work out. They were there really briefly, and I've read a couple of different reasons. It's because the Spanish were there, so it was very a tense area, but also I've read that it had to do with the climate as well. It was just very buggy, very muggy. And I know North Carolina isn't too different, but both of those reasons kind of played into them moving farther north. So they just skip right over North Carolina, and they actually end up in Pennsylvania for a substantial amount of time. And they settle some really amazing towns there that you could still visit today, like Lidditz, Bethlehem, and Nazareth. There's the big three towns up in Pennsylvania that are Moravian towns. But from Pennsylvania, they actually got an offer from Lord Granville in the 1750s. He offered the Moravians a land deal of almost 100,000 acres in North Carolina to come and settle. Yeah. So in 1752, they came down and surveyed the tract, and they picked the this 100,000-acre parcel, which they called Wachovia, which was named after the Wachau, which was Count Zinzendorf. You remember him? Yeah. Count Zinzendorf's estate was the Wachau or valley. This land reminded them of that, so they called it Wachovia, and they decided to settle it so that they could have a central town in the tract where they would create the center of commerce and trade and really capitalize, like you mentioned, on these settlers who were looking for goods. So even though the Moravians were separatist and very closed in their society, they relied really heavily on commerce and trade. And that was a very big part of their mission there, because they wanted to raise money to send back to the Moravian church in Germany. So they're kind of interesting in that they're closed, but also they need to start slightly opening more to accommodate visitors and travelers who are buying goods from them and from their artisans. So you'll see over time the Moravians start to open up. So it's a very interesting transition from super closed originally to slowly opening up to what they called strangers, is the word. That's a non-Moravian strangers in society. So they're very interesting to follow.
Well, that makes a lot of sense then, why you have these, the leaders of the Patriot Army would be familiar with the towns if they're big with trade and commerce there in North Carolina's Piedmont, where you have so many men coming from. And now you've kind of also mentioned talking about having very structured, and you've got a lot of trade, and you've got this, a very planned settlement. The accounts that we have from Loyalist prisoners talk about when they arrive in the towns, how there's a town of mechanics, and then there's towns of farmers. Like, it's very different. It's very, it's obvious to these new visitors that they're separate. Was this planned that way, that you had farmers on the left, mechanics on the right, or whatever?
It's a little more complicated than that, but I would say when they first arrived in Wachovia, they settled Bethabara first, and Bethabara was a center of commerce and trade, and it was very mercantile, and there were artisans there. Bethabara had that function, and that wasn't the plan for long term, though, because they really wanted Salem to be the central town. The Moravians were great planners, so the goal was to have Salem as the central town. But what they did not anticipate in their plan was the French and Indian War. Yeah. So Bethabara actually ended up playing a way bigger role than they originally anticipated, and it remained pretty heavily trades for longer than they expected. However, by 1780, which is when we're talking, the Bethabara has fully transitioned to an agricultural town. So finally, by the 1780s, they have achieved this sort of plan to have Bethabara and Bethania and other settlements turn more agricultural, and Salem to then become that central town that has the merchant and the trades and all of that. So by the time that they're arriving, yes, Salem would have been the town of mechanics, and the other towns would have been the towns of farmers.
So the same way you mentioned that Wachovia was designed to send money back to the church in Germany, even within Wachovia, you've got Salem as the hub, and then these other towns as the fingers.
Eventually, that is kind of how it turns out, yeah.
Okay, so very, very structured. Not like the pell-mell Scott-Irish just running rampant everywhere. Now, talking about the accounts, though, and then the descriptions of what they're seeing, a lot of the descriptions talk about the food. They talk about the cattle, both in the area and in the towns. They talk about the town bakeries, and they talk about bread and flour and grain and mills, orchards, lots of food supplies there in Bethabara and Salem. Is this something the Moravians are known for? Like, with their farming town being separate, is this a successful, like a booming farm town? Is this known by people?
Yeah, so Bethabara and Salem and all of the Moravian towns, they were known for having good supplies, especially because Salem at this point was a major exporter of so many goods. And the Moravians just had a very extensive trade network because of their connection to the Pennsylvania towns, that they really became kind of the economic center of Wachovia and even the Piedmont. So they knew that Bethabara and Salem were the place to go for supplies, because Bethabara, also being a pretty successful agricultural town, did have large surpluses of food and other commodities. So it was common for people to stop there, to stop at the tavern or get something from the merchant, or, if you're stopping over like these guys did, eat the food supply. But even the Cherokee, they referred to Bethabara as the place with good bread, which I love. I love that. So Bethabara was known by many to be, and Salem, to be places of commerce and abundance. But I would say they were nowhere near stocked enough to handle what was to come.
Wow. Okay, so you've got all kinds of food supplies, all kinds of trade, extremely well known. It's really easy to see why this army with their prisoners needing a place to go would have thought of Bethabara and Salem as a good place.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead, and we're kind of out of time for this one. I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us, explain a little bit more. We'll have to follow this up with another video, diving into more details about the actual interaction between these two. But thank you for the background on the brethren. Really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for watching this Trail Talk episode. Again, watch for the next video, part 2 with Samantha Smith, talking about how the Moravians, the United Brethren, are involved in this story of the aftermath of Kings Mountain and the Overmountain Victory Trail. So thank you.
Thank you.